In the subway car, a man tapped my shoulder and said, "Get off at the next stop or you'll die." The tap on my shoulder was firm, 2 knuckles pressed hard enough to bruise, and when I turned around, a stranger in a gray hoodie was leaning close enough that I could smell coffee on his breath. "Get off at the next stop or you'll die," he said, flat and quiet, like he was reading me a bus schedule instead of a death sentence. I laughed, actually laughed, because the Q train at 11:52 p.m. is exactly the kind of place where you expect a stranger to say something unhinged. Then I saw his eyes, and there was nothing unhinged about them. There was something worse. There was certainty. I'd been riding the same train home from the same late shift for 11 months, ever since my company moved offices downtown, and I knew the rhythm of that car the way you know your own heartbeat. My name is Nolan Ashworth, 34 years old, a project manager for a logistics software firm, engaged for 8 months to a woman named Petra Marlowe, who I thought was the best thing that had ever happened to me. I looked at the stranger's hoodie, at his unshaven jaw, at the way his hand had already drifted toward the emergency intercom button, like he was counting down a timer in his head, and something in my chest went cold before my brain had even caught up to why. The train was slowing for the next station, brakes screeching in that particular way that always made my teeth ache, and I had maybe 15 seconds to decide whether a stranger's warning was a threat or a rescue. I looked around the car. 6 other passengers, none of them paying attention, everyone locked into their phones the way New Yorkers do to avoid eye contact with exactly this kind of situation. A woman near the doors kept glancing at me and then away, too quickly, like she'd been told not to look. The doors opened with their tired hydraulic hiss. The stranger's hand closed around my forearm. "Now," he said, "please." I'd met Petra at a mutual friend's rooftop party 3 years earlier, both of us reaching for the same bottle of wine, both of us laughing about it long after the joke had stopped being funny. She was 31, sharp and magnetic, a marketing director for a mid-size beverage company, the kind of woman who remembered baristas' names and made everyone in a room feel like the most interesting person in it. My mother loved her instantly. My coworkers asked when we were getting married before I'd even bought a ring. Everything about our life together felt solid, the kind of solid you stop examining because examining it feels paranoid. The early red flag, the one I explained away for months, was a man named Dario Calloway, introduced to me as Petra's cousin from her mother's side, a soft-spoken guy in his late 30s who ran some kind of consulting business she was vague about. He started appearing at more of our dinners than seemed normal for a cousin, sitting a little too close to Petra, laughing at her jokes a beat too early, like he'd already heard them rehearsed. I told myself families are complicated, that closeness between cousins wasn't automatically suspicious, that my discomfort said more about my own insecurity than anything actually happening in front of me. I was wrong about almost all of that, though it took a stranger's hand on my arm to prove it. The next red flag came 10 months before that subway car, when Petra sat me down with paperwork and told me it was time we both got serious about protecting each other financially. She'd already researched life insurance policies, already had quotes ready, already knew exactly which underwriter offered the fastest approval with the least medical scrutiny for a healthy 34-year-old man. I remember thinking it was thoughtful, even mature, the kind of adult decision people made when they were building a real future together. I signed where she pointed, barely reading the coverage amount, trusting the woman I was going to marry the way you trust gravity, without ever once checking whether it deserved that trust. I told myself it was nothing when Dario started calling Petra at hours that didn't match any reasonable definition of family business, sometimes after midnight, her voice dropping low and private when she answered, always stepping into the bathroom or out onto the balcony to finish the call. I rationalized it the way I'd rationalized everything else, telling myself some families just talk more, that Dario's consulting business probably ran on unpredictable hours, that jealousy over her own cousin would make me look small and controlling if I ever said anything out loud. The cold part of me that noticed these things got quieter every time I fed it a reasonable explanation, and reasonable explanations were the one thing Petra never seemed to run out of. 3 months before the subway car, I noticed a man in a dark green jacket standing outside my office building 2 mornings in a row, not doing anything suspicious exactly, just present in a way that started to feel deliberate once I saw him a 3rd time near my gym. I told myself the city is full of people who happen to be in the same place as you are, that noticing patterns in strangers was the kind of thing that happened when you'd been under too much wedding planning stress. My stomach disagreed with my rationalizations every single time, tightening into a hard knot whenever I caught that green jacket in my peripheral vision, but I didn't say anything to Petra, because some instinct I couldn't name told me not to. 6 weeks before the subway car, my car's brakes failed on the West Side Highway at rush hour, the pedals sinking to the floor with no resistance at all, forcing me to grind against the guardrail for almost 200 feet before I finally stopped. The mechanic who towed it told me the brake line had been cut clean, not worn through, cut, a straight incision that no amount of normal wear could explain. I filed it under bad luck and vandalism, the kind of thing that happens in a city with 8 million strangers, even though some part of me kept circling back to the fact that my car had been parked in our building's garage the entire week before, a garage with keycard access limited to residents and their approved guests. 2 weeks before the subway car, I was walking home from a late dinner when 2 men jumped me near an alley entrance, one grabbing my wallet while the other held a knife loosely at my ribs, professional and unhurried in a way that street muggings usually aren't. They took my wallet and my watch and left without touching my phone, which struck me as strange even in the moment. Strange enough that I mentioned it to Petra when I got home, hands still shaking as I described it. She held me and told me the city wasn't safe anymore, that we should think about moving somewhere with better security, and I let her comfort talk me out of the small, persistent voice asking why professional-looking muggers would leave a $600 phone untouched on the ground. My hands were still shaking from that mugging 2 weeks later when the stranger on the Q train grabbed my forearm and pulled me toward the closing doors, and something in my body simply obeyed before my mind finished arguing with itself. I stumbled onto the platform at the last possible second, the doors sliding shut behind me with a pneumatic hiss that felt like punctuation on a sentence I hadn't finished reading. The train pulled away, and through the scratched window of the car I'd just left, I saw a man in a dark green jacket standing exactly where I'd been sitting, staring at the empty seat with an expression that had nothing confused about it at all. The stranger who'd pulled me off the train didn't let go of my arm right away, and up close, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the platform, he looked less like a threat and more like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. He introduced himself as Elias Thorne, a detective with the Nipt Transit Bureau, 19 years on the job, and pulled a badge from inside his hoodie that I checked twice with shaking hands before I let myself believe it. That man in the green jacket has killed at least 3 people on subway platforms in the last 2 years, he said, watching my face carefully for the moment the words landed. Tonight, I think you were supposed to be the 4th. I asked him how he could possibly know that, my voice coming out thinner than I wanted it to, and Detective Thorne told me he'd spent the last 14 months working an unofficial pattern nobody else in his department had connected yet. 3 deaths ruled accidental platform pushes, all victims men in their 30s with large life insurance policies taken out within the previous year, all deaths occurring during rush hour chaos where camera angles conveniently failed to capture the moment of contact. He'd built a photo file of a man matching Dario's build and gait present near all 3 incidents, close enough for facial comparison but never quite clear enough for an arrest. Tonight, watching that same man tail me onto the Q train, he'd decided he couldn't wait for department paperwork to catch up to his gut. We sat in an all-night diner 2 blocks from the station, and Detective Thorne laid 3 case files on the table between us. Names I didn't recognize attached to men whose photos looked disturbingly ordinary, the kind of faces you'd forget within an hour of passing them on the street. Each file included insurance claim numbers, autopsy summaries listing cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with train impact, and a note in the margin, handwritten, reading, beneficiary flagged, insufficient evidence. I asked him why none of these cases had gone anywhere, and he said the same thing detectives always say about hard cases, that suspicion isn't proof, and juries don't convict on patterns alone, they convict on evidence you can hold in your hand. I told him about Petra, about the insurance policy, about Dario's late-night calls and the cut brake line and the mugging that left my phone untouched, and I watched his expression shift from professional neutrality into something sharper as each detail landed. He asked how much the policy was worth, and when I told him $2.4 million, he set down his coffee cup carefully, like his hand needed a second to steady itself. That's the highest amount I've seen in this pattern, he said. which means either they're getting more confident or they're running out of time on something. I didn't understand what he meant by that yet, but the way he said it made my stomach drop into my shoes. Detective Thorne connected me the next morning with Renee Fontaine, a certified fraud examiner working the Special Investigations Unit for the insurance carrier that had issued our policy, a woman with 14 years of experience specifically in life insurance fraud, who took one look at our policy documents and went quiet in a way that told me everything before she said a word. She explained that policies exceeding $2 million automatically triggered a deeper underwriting review after any suspicious claim activity, and that our policy, submitted 10 months earlier, had already been flagged internally for an unusually rushed medical exam and a beneficiary change request filed just 6 weeks after issuance, moving primary beneficiary status entirely to Petra, with no contingent beneficiary listed at all. Renee pulled records showing that Petra had also quietly taken out a secondary accidental death rider 4 months after the original policy, a rider that specifically doubled the payout if death occurred during a violent crime or public transit incident, the exact scenario that had killed all 3 of Detective Thorne's previous victims. She told me plainly, without softening it, that in her professional experience this combination, rushed underwriting, sole beneficiary designation, and a transit-specific accidental death rider, was one of the clearest fraud signatures she'd encountered in over a decade of casework. Hearing a professional name the pattern out loud, giving it a category instead of leaving it as some shapeless private fear, did something to my chest that felt almost like relief mixed with nausea. Assistant District Attorney Colette Vance joined the case a week later, a prosecutor with 9 years in the Special Victims and Organized Fraud Bureau, brought in specifically because Detective Thorne's 3 prior cases finally had a living witness willing to cooperate, instead of a body waiting for an autopsy report. She sat across from me in a conference room lined with case boxes and told me, in the careful language prosecutors use when they need something from you, that we had a genuine opportunity to close 3 unsolved homicides and prevent a 4th, but only if I was willing to keep living my normal life for a few more weeks while they built an airtight case around me as bait. I didn't want to be bait, I said so, more than once, my hands shaking against the conference table while ADA Vance and Detective Thorne exchanged a look that told me they'd expected exactly that reaction. Vance explained that without catching Dario in the act, or without a recorded admission from Petra, they had circumstantial evidence strong enough to investigate, but not strong enough to guarantee a conviction on 3 prior murders, and that if I simply disappeared into witness protection now, Petra and Dario would likely walk away, adjust their methods, and eventually find another target with another insurance policy. The thought of that happening to someone else, some other man trusting some other version of Petra's careful smile, made the decision for me more than any legal argument could have. Malik Okonkwo, a forensic accountant working alongside Renee's fraud unit, spent the next several days tracing Petra's finances with a thoroughness that turned my stomach in new ways. He found that Petra had accumulated $94,000 in personal debt over the past 2 years, most of it funneled into a joint venture with Dario, a consulting business that existed almost entirely on paper, its only real transactions being cash withdrawals matching dates close to each of Detective Thorne's 3 prior deaths. Malik's report showed wire transfers between Petra's personal account and an account registered to Dario just 9 days before my car's brake line was cut, a payment described in the memo line only as final phase, language that made the detective actually swear out loud when he read it. I moved back into our apartment that same week, forcing myself to sit across from Petra at dinner, to kiss her goodnight, to let her believe nothing had changed, all while wearing a recording device Detective Thorne's team had fitted under my shirt collar with a precision that felt almost surgical. My hands wouldn't stop shaking the first night, and I excused myself to the bathroom twice, just to press my palms flat against the cold tile and remind myself to breathe normally. Petra never noticed, or if she did, she never said anything, which frightened me more than open suspicion would have, because it meant she'd gotten comfortable enough in her plan to stop watching me closely. The recordings over the following 10 days captured smaller admissions than I'd hoped for, careful half-sentences that a defense attorney could argue away in court, Petra mentioning to Dario on a call that the timeline's getting tight and that he can't keep getting lucky, conversations that told me everything I needed emotionally, but Vance said weren't enough legally to move forward with an arrest. Detective Thorne warned me that suspects this careful sometimes waited months between attempts, professional enough to let suspicion cool before trying again. And that meant I might be looking at weeks or longer of living inside a lie with a woman who was quietly waiting for the right moment to have me killed. The crisis peaked on a Thursday morning, 16 days after the subway car, when Petra told me over breakfast that she'd booked us both on the 9:40 p.m. Q train that night, insisting we take the subway instead of a car service to save money for the wedding, a suggestion so specific and so uncharacteristic of her usual habits that Detective Thorne's team treated it as an active operational threat the moment I texted him from the bathroom. He called an emergency meeting for noon, and by 1 o'clock, Renee, Malik, and ADA Vance were all crowded into a conference room with him, staring at a subway map with red pins marking the exact stretch of platform where all 3 prior deaths had occurred, a stretch our planned route would pass through at 9:52 p.m. that same night. I had less than 9 hours to decide whether to walk willingly into what looked like a coordinated attempt on my life, wired for sound, surrounded by plainclothes officers I couldn't see, or to call it off and lose whatever chance we had at catching Dario with enough evidence to close 3 murders. Detective Thorne laid it out plainly, telling me his team could position 6 officers along that platform by 9:30, undercover as commuters, close enough to intervene within seconds if anything happened, but he wouldn't force me into it, and if I said no, they'd find another way to build the case, even if it took longer, and even if it meant Petra and Dario might sense the investigation and disappear. My stomach dropped somewhere around my knees, but somewhere underneath the fear was a colder, steadier voice telling me this was the only way 3 dead men would finally get justice. I said yes, and the rest of that afternoon moved in a blur of equipment checks and briefings, a second recording device sewn into my jacket lining as backup, a panic signal built into my watch that would trigger if I tapped the crown 3 times in quick succession. Detective Thorne repeating the extraction plan to me so many times, it started sounding like a lullaby instead of a life-or-death procedure. At 8:50 p.m., I stood in our bedroom watching Petra apply lipstick in the mirror, humming something under her breath, looking so completely ordinary that for one disorienting second I wanted to believe none of this was real, that Malik's spreadsheets and Renee's fraud reports and Detective Thorne's 3 case files had all somehow been an elaborate misunderstanding. The platform at 9:52 p.m. was exactly as crowded as Detective Thorne had predicted, rush hour thinning but not gone, enough bodies packed near the yellow safety line to make any single push look accidental to a panicked crowd. I felt Petra's hand slide into mine as the train's headlights appeared in the tunnel, her grip tightening in a way that used to feel affectionate and now felt like a countdown. I scanned the platform the way Thorne had trained me to, spotting a woman in a red coat who was actually an undercover officer, a man reading a newspaper who wasn't really reading it, small anchors of safety hidden inside a crowd that otherwise looked completely indifferent to what was about to happen. I saw Dario before Petra did, stepping out from behind a support column roughly 15 feet down the platform, dressed in an ordinary gray coat instead of the green jacket, close enough to reach me the instant the crowd surged toward the opening doors. My pulse spiked so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I forced myself to keep breathing normally, to keep my hand loose in Petra's, to let this play out exactly the way Detective Thorne needed it to. The train roared into the station, wind rushing hot and metallic across the platform, and in the half-second before the doors opened, I felt Petra's hand release mine entirely, stepping half a pace back in a motion so small a stranger would never have noticed it. Dario moved fast, faster than I expected, closing the distance in 3 long strides with both hands raised toward my shoulder blades, exactly the way the autopsy reports described the previous victims being struck. I twisted sideways at the last possible second, the way we'd rehearsed twice that afternoon in an empty precinct hallway, and his palms caught my jacket instead of my back, ripping fabric instead of finding solid contact to shove me forward into the train's path. The woman in the red coat was already moving, badge raised, shouting words that got swallowed by the train's brakes screaming against the rails, and within 4 seconds, 3 more plainclothes officers had converged from different directions, taking Dario down hard against the concrete platform, while the crowd around us finally registered that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Petra screamed, a sound so convincingly horrified that for one disorienting heartbeat I almost believed she hadn't known. almost believed she was as blindsided as the strangers now filming everything on their phones around us. Then Detective Thorne stepped directly into her path, his badge already raised, and told her in a voice loud enough for the recording devices to catch clearly that she was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. And something in her face changed the instant she understood the operation had been running around her for weeks, not against Dario alone, but against her too. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely, her horrified expression collapsing into something colder and more calculating, the real face underneath finally visible to everyone standing close enough to see it. They processed Dario and Petra separately at the precinct that night, and Detective Thorne let me sit in an observation room while Renee and Malik walked ADA Vance through the financial evidence one final time before formal charges were filed. Petra's interrogation lasted almost 3 hours, her attorney arriving 40 minutes in and immediately advising silence, but not before she'd said enough on the initial recording to make even her own lawyer visibly wince. She'd told the first responding officer, before her attorney arrived, that she never wanted it to be like this, a sentence that would later become one of the most quoted lines in Vance's closing argument, proof that some awareness of the plan had existed inside her long before that platform. The forensic evidence Malik and Renee had compiled over the following weeks connected Dario directly to all 3 prior deaths through a combination of transit camera footage timestamps, matching insurance beneficiary patterns, and a burner phone recovered from his apartment containing a group chat with 2 other women whose fiancés had died on subway platforms in the previous 18 months. Detective Thorne's unofficial hunch turned out to be the tip of something much larger, a loose network Dario had built posing as a sympathetic outsider to women trapped in bad relationships, offering to solve their financial problems in exchange for a cut of the insurance payout, 3 completed jobs before ours and, according to the messages, at least 2 more in early planning stages that were immediately shut down once his arrest went public. The trial began 7 months later, and I sat in the gallery every day it was in session, watching ADA Vance lay out the evidence with the same methodical precision Renee and Malik had used to build it in the first place. She played the recordings from my jacket, entered Malik's financial reports as Exhibit F, and called Detective Thorne to testify about the pattern he'd tracked for over a year before anyone believed him enough to act. Petra's attorney tried arguing she'd been manipulated by Dario, coerced into a plan she never fully understood the violence of, but the recorded phone calls describing the timeline getting tight and the beneficiary change filed within weeks of our engagement told a different, far more deliberate story to the jury. The jury deliberated for 11 hours before convicting Petra of conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud, and Dario of 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, his defense unable to explain away the burner phone, the time-stamped surveillance stills, or the testimony of the 2 other women who came forward once his name hit the news, describing eerily similar consulting arrangements he'd offered them years earlier. The judge sentenced Dario to life without the possibility of parole, calling his pattern predatory in the most calculated sense the law has language for, and sentenced Petra to 22 years, noting that her willingness to let 3 prior murders happen without intervening made her complicity, not ignorance, the true center of her defense. I sold the apartment 8 months after the trial ended, unable to keep living in rooms where I'd once trusted a woman who'd been counting down to my death over breakfast conversations and lipstick in the mirror. Detective Thorne and I still get coffee every few months, an odd friendship built entirely out of one impossible night on a subway platform, and he told me once, half joking, that in 19 years on the Transit Bureau, I was the only person who'd ever actually listened to a stranger fast enough to matter. Renee's unit used our case to update their internal fraud detection protocols, flagging rushed underwriting combined with transit-specific riders as an automatic review trigger now written into training material across the entire company. 2 years after that night, I started seeing someone new, a woman named Ines Solano who runs a small architecture firm and laughs easily and has never once made me feel like examining her would be an insult. I told her the whole story on our 4th date, half expecting her to bolt from a man who came with 3 unsolved murders and a fraud trial attached to his history, but she just took my hand across the table and asked what happened to the other 2 women Dario had approached, the ones whose partners had somehow gotten out in time. I didn't have a clean answer for her, only the knowledge that somewhere out there, 2 other men were alive because a detective refused to stop chasing a pattern nobody else believed was real.